All right, everyone. Now we are moving into Module 5. So we're getting a little bit closer to actually starting to get into the common grasses that we run into in the landscape around here and other parts of the country. But before we do that, we have to kind of bridge between the biology of turfgrass and that. So this is where we get into morphology. And if you remember from our last session, we were talking about a little bit about morphology in the sense of the C3 versus the C4. But morphology is the study of basically the appearance of things. So, when we're looking at morphology, we're looking at the physical characteristics, and so if you remember from the other section, also we talked about phenotype. So phenotype would be the visual expression of the genetics in an organism. So it's how we see, how we visualize, how we interpret the genetics of an organism. And so when we get into morphology, we're actually looking at and studying these phenotypical traits. Okay, so the physical features of a living thing would be the morphology. Okay, and just like anything, turfgrass has morphology also. So when we talk about it, I'm going to start breaking down into a lot of the different physical features of a grass plant. And so these are things that all grass plants have, more or less. Some of them look a little bit different than others, but they all have these. So these would be kind of your general morphological characteristics of grass. So starting off, we have the stem, and the stem, you have two components. You have the node and you have the internode. So the internode, inter meaning in between. So the internode would be the portion of the stem between each node. Typically, the internodal region is what will give rise to each individual blade of grass on the grass plant. So nodes can be jointed at the node. They can have an open blade sheath on the node. They could have a tight blade sheath around. The biggest thing is that sometimes you'll see what's called jointing on the node, and sometimes it's less characteristic, kind of like the previous picture. You might just see a small region, but at any rate, you can see the delineation between the unbladed portion of the stem. Then you move into the node, and then the node is basically what gives rise to the next blade of a grass species, the next leaf coming off of that stem. So the leaves or blades extend again from this internodal region. So the base of the blade will start at the node, and then it breaks away from the node, and that's what gives rise to the actual blade of grass. Then you have the culm. So the culm would be the region of exposed stem not covered by a blade. So it's a portion of the stem that you see, it extends to the next node, which is where the next blade of grass would originate from. But it is the portion of stem that is not covered by any blade or actually the blade sheath. And it's the piece of the stem between the blade and the next node, or the inflorescence, which would be the flower. So the blade sheath, again, this is the portion of the blade of grass. It's actually part of the blade of grass that actually wraps around the stem. So again, it originates at the node, but it is the portion of the blade of grass that is still tightly, it's still wrapped around the blade sheet or around the stem. I'm sorry. So it can be split or open. It can overlap. It could be closed, so it may not necessarily look like anything, but it is in fact part of the leaf, which is in grass would be the blade of grass. So it is a portion of the leaf that is still attached or wrapped around the stem on a grass plant. So the sheath region can be hairy, or it can be smooth. Sometimes there are little hairs that come off of it. Sometimes there's like a fine velvety hair to it, or sometimes they're just very smooth. But again, this can all be part of a, when we look at phenotype and we look at morphology and then we relate it back to the taxonomic identification, we can use this as an identifying characteristic between different species of grass. So another very important topic when it comes to the stem and the sheath and the blade and all of that, a very, very important characteristic identification. It's actually, if you refer back in your taxonomic key in the beginning of Weeds of Northeast, it's in there. You'll see it is a main, at least in that taxonomic key, it is the main division that they use to break between the types of grass. And so that's this topic of vernation. So vernation, when you look, if you were to take a grass stem and you would cut it in half, and you looked at the end of that stem, then you would see it's either folded or it's rolled. And so that is, as you look at that stem, as you see the new blades of grass that are forming inside of that stem and giving rise to the next blades of grass that come off of that stem, they're either going to be folded or rolled inside of that stem. And that's a very important identifying characteristic, especially in lawns in Northeast Ohio. It can be a very important, one of the first things that you can probably look at when you're trying to determine what type of grass is growing in the lawn. So then we move into the collar region. So the collar region on a blade of grass would be the part where you have the sheath and then you have the blade. And so the collar region would be the point on the grass leaf where that sheath and blade come together. So it's a point where the blade starts to bend away from the stem and bend outward. The collar region between the blade and sheath can be broad. It could be very narrow. It could be a continuous collar, or it could be somewhat divided. So when you look at the coloration on the collar region, again, this is the point basically where the blade of grass folds away from the stem. So sometimes it's divided, or you can see that band extends completely across the blade. And there's a few other structures that originate on this collar region. So one of those structures would be called the auricle. Again, this is another important, probably more important identifying characteristic of grasses than even the collar region. The collar region is more subtle, but plants will either have an auricle or they won't. Okay, grass plants. So the auricles can be clasping and claw-like to where they actually wrap around the stem, or they could be short and stubby, or they could be completely absent. Sometimes you'll see this very smooth transition from the blade sheath right into the collar and into the blade of grass. So not every species has this, which is, again, a very important, very small detail. Sometimes, especially in your turf grasses, you might need to take a little hand lens or something to actually be able to see it. So another morphological feature that is in the collar region is the ligule. So the ligule is this like membrane. It separates the blade of grass from the stem. So it's basically kind of like a gasket. If you think about it, it's a gasket that allows the blade and the stem and the subsequent leaves on that stem to extend past a lower leaf. So it's just kind of that. It's a membrane that exists between the leaf and the sheath and the stem. It can be membranous, as you can see in this picture here. There's a really good one there on the right. It can be a fringe of hairs, as you can see in some of the middle pictures, or like in the Phragmites, you can see it there, very good. Or it could be completely absent. It just, when I say absent, there's still a membrane there. It's just not visible. There's no visible portion of that membrane extending above that collar region. So, and that would again be called the ligule. So this collar region can also be hairy, or it can be smooth. So again, another identifying feature between different grass species. Some grasses actually have some pretty wild hairs coming off of this. Some of them have some very fine hairs. Some of them have no hairs at all. When we move away from the stem and we move out onto the blade of grass, sometimes a blade of grass can have a very prominent midvein, or it can have veins that are very equally and evenly spaced across the leaf. Again, this can be another identifying morphological characteristic that helps us to separate species. The blade tip. What does the tip of the blade, if you actually have it? In a mowed lawn, it can sometimes be hard to see the tip of a blade of grass, but if left to grow, out, you'll definitely see a blade tip on all grasses. So usually they're either pointed or they're rounded. There's also on some of your grasses, you can have what's called a boat or prow shaped blade tip. So if you think about the hull of a boat, how you think about the bow, how it comes to that point, but it's kind of like a cup, like if you were taking your hands and cupping them together. So that would be a boat or prow shaped tip. It typically occurs when you have a folded vernation, and if you imagine the blade of grass still has that kind of fold in it from the folded vernation, but it comes to a point. So that's real common. An example of a grass that would have this would be bluegrass, and that's a very unique. You can almost single-handedly identify Kentucky bluegrass in our lawns, pretty much with that boat-shaped tip. So it is a very, very unique characteristic. The blade margin itself, you're not necessarily going to see this. You would probably have to zoom in on it really good, but sometimes you can feel it. So the blade margin can either be smooth or toothed, okay? And the way you would know is if you took a blade of grass and then you ran your finger along the edge. Sometimes you can run it up the blade of grass and you'll feel nothing. It'll feel smooth, but then try and slide it backward and your finger almost gets stuck, or you feel like that saw-like, or sandpaper-like texture, and that would be the teeth on the blade margin. A lot of grasses, you're not going to probably have this, but again, depending on your grass species, this can be an identifying characteristic. Usually when we look at grasses, the roots are fibrous. We don't really run into tuberous roots or any other sort of significant underground structure. Normally the roots are fibrous on your grass species. Some of them can be thicker and a little bit fleshier, but they're pretty much all going to have a fibrous root system. Some of these root systems can actually go very deep. Some of you on your, your turfgrass benefit assignment reference this and that's one of the things that makes grass very beneficial to soil stabilization. It also is one of the characteristics that it developed that allows it to survive in adverse conditions. Because, even on a mowed lawn, you might only see this very short, visible, portion of the grass that's, 2, 3, 4 inches tall. But what you may not see is that it may have a root system that's extending 8, 9, 10 inches. Sometimes, like on an open prairie situation, it can be several feet down into the ground. And that root system obviously helps it to scour for nutrients and water. Obviously, the main reason it's sending a root system that deep is for water. But it also will help with carbohydrate reserve. So, turfgrass learned early on that if it wanted to survive, putting all of its energy and resources above the ground might not be the best thing. So it actually does use the root system as an energy storage mechanism, and it will call on that in times of need. The heart of the grass plant is called the crown, and the crown is right at the soil interface. So it's right basically where the soil and the air meet. This is another very, very unique, evolution that gave rise to grass plants. So the growth point of the actual plant, so all of the magic in this plant happens on the crown. So all of the meristems, if you remember from, I don't know if they talked about meristems in your woodies or your other ornamental classes, but the meristem is the growth point, okay? And like a tree, for example, if you think about the structure of a tree, if you look at your branches, they all have terminal buds and axillary buds. All of those points are meristems. You also have another meristem basically at the, again, at the soil interface. All right. So, that meristem basically, the tissue of the tree either differentiates into the trunk and the top, the above air structures, or it goes downward and turns into the root system and root structures of the plant. So you also have the vascular cambium on a tree, which is, again, what allows the tree trunk to grow and expand. So, a lot of plants, most plants have multiple growth points on the plant. Grass is different. Grass only has one point of meristematic growth, and this structure called the crown is what gives rise to the roots. It gives rise to the flower. It gives rise to the blades and the stems that come off of it. It also gives rise to other secondary reproductive structures on the plant that, again, are kind of unique to grass plants. So the crown holds the meristems for all parts of the plant: the root, the leaves, the stems, tillers, rhizomes, stolons, seed heads, you name it. It all originates from the meristem. Okay, it's also the main energy store of the plant. I mean, it's cool. I mean, it's not exactly what a grass crown looks like. I think this picture is a little bit better determination of it, but it gives you the idea. It almost looks like a bulb, right? Like a radish or a turnip or something like that. And it's kind of the same concept, except that this is right at that soil-air interface, so all of the meristematic growth occurs here. It also is a main energy store for the plant. And it's really this structure, the crown, that has made turfgrass so adaptable. If you think back, when we look at how grass was originally used, or how it evolved initially, but then also how we've used it in a landscape, the fact that this crown on a grass plant exists is what allows us to use it so extensively in the landscape It's what makes it such a suitable plant for pastures, for grazing. It's what allowed it, when it evolved in the, the wild natural environment. It's what allowed it to kind of evolve and cohabitate with grazing and foraging wildlife, at that time. So it really is kind of neat because the plant, in essence, is what it's saying is it can afford to kill off or waste the other parts that it produces, because the only thing it really cares about ultimately protecting is this crown. It can kill off the roots, it can kill off the grass, it can kill off the flowers, it can literally kill off the entire plant. As long as this crown stays intact and alive, then it can regenerate from this point. Kill the crown, you kill the plant. That's its only Achilles heel. If you kill it, it will die. So during drought and cold, this may be the only part of the plant that survives. And this is a little bit nicer picture, I think, of what's kind of going on with that meristem in the plant. So it gives you an idea, and it's right there at that soil air interface. So anything below goes into roots down below, anything above turns into blades of grass, stems, and reproductive structures. So you want to avoid damage to the crown. So if we have our first maintenance or management lesson here today, this is it. You want to avoid damage to the crown by avoiding scalping, top dressing and lawn rolling. Any of these practices are going to damage the crown to some degree. And if you damage the crown, you're going to kill it. Now, again, you can scalp grass and it doesn't necessarily kill it off. Okay. But if you completely damage that crown beyond the point that it can repair itself and recover, you will, in essence, kill the plant. So that is its only Achilles heel. That's also a main target on the plant for a lot of insects and a lot of diseases, because again, it is the food and energy source of the plant. So if you're a bug and you derive your livelihood on eating grass plants, where's the best place to go? So a lot of our surface insects do actually seek out and destroy the crown. And if we do have, a problem with some of these insects, unfortunately, this is one where if they do get in there and they eat the crown of the grass and they kill the lawn off that way, that lawn is dead. I'm sorry. It's not going to be resurrected, and you are probably going to have to go in and reseed in that situation. So, grass plants can reproduce both sexually and asexually. So sexually in a plant would be a flower. Grasses are angiosperms. They do produce a flower. We don't always think about that, but when we see the little seed head form on there, the first thing that comes out obviously is what's called the inflorescence, or the flower, and then the flower is what actually gives rise to seed. So a grass plant could not produce seed if it didn't flower. It is a flowering plant, an angiosperm, versus a gymnosperm. It is an angiosperm and it is a flowering plant. Okay. But it does have the ability to reproduce in other ways. And one of the ways that grass plants can reproduce is through cloning. And they clone a couple of different ways. One way would be the rhizome. The rhizome is an underground lateral stem. It gives rise to roots, shoots at its nodes. So everywhere that rhizome grows and then forms a node, that node will give rise to another plant. Grasses also send out an above ground stem, which is called a stolon. So it kind of looks very similar to a rhizome when it's coming out of the plant, but it grows above the surface versus below the surface. And again, these stolons will give rise to a root and shoot. at its nodes. So examples of grasses that have rhizomes would be Kentucky bluegrass in our lawn setting. In a natural setting, there's a weedy grass called Johnson grass. Another example would be bamboo. If you've ever seen bamboo rhizomes, they're pretty nasty. I mean, you can impale somebody on one of them. Another weedy grass that'll grow in a lawn setting is a grass called quackgrass. So these are all examples of grasses that grow rhizomes. Examples of grasses that produce stolons would be creeping bentgrass, zoysia grass, Bermuda grass, St. Augustine would be another one. So these are grasses that produce stolons. So these again are a secondary, like a stem. So it's like the stem that grows up that gives way to the blades, but it's a different type of stem. These are lateral stems that the plant will put out, and they have a node, and at that node they will produce a clonally identical plant. So again, they call them daughter plants from the mother plant. These are genetically, clonally identical to the mother plant. They also tiller. Okay, so a grass plant tillers, a tiller, if we go back here, a couple of slides here. So a tiller is actually a plant. It's an axillary bud here that actually forms a whole new plant, again, that's clonally identical to the mother plant. But you see it's kind of like this little shoot that forms off to the side of a plant. Right out of the crown. It's usually adjacent to the mother plant. It would be a daughter plant again. All grasses have the ability to tiller. So they all tiller, okay? Every grass tillers. They don't necessarily produce rhizomes or stolons. So some grasses, in addition to tillering, have the ability to produce either a rhizome or a stolon, or in some cases, they might produce both. All right. These are all forms of asexual reproduction, meaning that the plant is cloning itself. Okay. These are genetically identical. All tiller, stolon, and rhizome derived daughter plants are all genetically identical to the mother plant. This is not a sexual reproduction. It's important because grass plants, on average, a grass plant, so this plant in the center here, will probably have a lifespan of about 4 to 5 years. They're not a forever plant. They do die after a certain number of years, typically about 4 to 5 years. So that's where these tillers and these daughter plants that come from the rhizomes and stolons are important, because this plant will not live forever. It'll terminate itself at about 4 to 5 years. But the tillers and the other daughter plants that are created by it will live on again for 4 to 5 years. And so this cycle of regeneration is continually occurring. It also happens because, that plant, in order to survive, when we talk about the biology of things, and C4 pathways and all these mechanisms that the plant comes up with is for survival of the species. Okay. It's trying to live on. All right. That's the natural order of things. It's trying to continue its legacy. It's trying to live on. So reproduction is very important. Okay. And if you're in adverse conditions, it may not have the ability to produce seed, or the seed may not be viable, and that might be that plant's only shot of continuing on its legacy. So this is an adaptation that, and it's not necessarily unique to grass or other plants that sucker and send up lateral shoots. Okay. But it is something that, is very characteristic of grasses, and they do this and they do it very well. So most grasses spread primarily by tillering. And again, this would be an example of perennial ryegrass. So, Again, there's always exceptions to the rule, but generally speaking, if we have to generalize around about, say, tall fescue or perennial ryegrass, they predominantly reproduce or spread by tillering. Again, this allows the plant to very quickly populate an area. If you imagine a grass seed lands somewhere, it germinates, that plant lives, okay? It's survival of the fittest. It wants to fend itself. It wants to be able to survive and grow and populate an area and crowd out any other competitors. Okay. So competitors could be other grass species. Competitors could be other plants. So that grass wants to get in there. It wants to grow and it wants to take over as quickly as it can. And so again, one of the things it does is it tillers, and it will produce any number of these lateral plants over that 4 to 5 year period before it finally dies. So, like I said before, grass does have the ability to sexually reproduce. It is considered an angiosperm. If you remember back to the Linnaeus breakdown that we were doing, the Linnaean domain and everything. It is an angiosperm. It's a monocot. It is an angiosperm. It has flowers. It sexually reproduces, which means it is going to cross itself with other members of the same species, and it will produce seed that basically is a genetic recombination of traits from one plant and another plant. So genetically, they're the same species. But again, remember we got into genetic variation and variety. So one of the ways that plants will evolve and adapt is they take DNA from one plant, they take DNA from another plant, and it's kind of like a mad scientist, throw it all together, shake it up, see what comes out in the form of a seed. It gives rise to a new plant. Hey, maybe that plant has the ability to, it developed a slightly different advantageous trait that allows it to survive in some harsh conditions that the original parent plants didn't contribute. And this is what all of our turfgrass breeding and hybridization focuses on, is sexual reproduction. You're trying to take one plant from a species, like one tall fescue plant, you're going to try to take another tall fescue plant from another species, you're going to try and cross the traits, and you're going to try and get some sort of beneficial combination out of that plant that gives rise to a new variety. Maybe it's got heat tolerance, drought tolerance, maybe it's better rooting, maybe it establishes quicker, maybe it germinates quicker, any number of things that we're looking for in the form of a trait. And this is where it all centers on, is sexual reproduction. Again, grass is an angiosperm. It does flower. It does produce seeds inside an ovary enclosed within the flower. Okay? So that's what separates angiosperms from gymnosperms. Okay? The angiosperms produce seed inside an ovary enclosed within the flower. Gymnosperms don't do that. We call that flower an inflorescence or a seed head, and there's 3 primary types. You have the raceme, you have the panicle, and you have the spike. Okay, they all kind of look very similar. Okay, the difference would be basically the spike. You have the little flower. This would be an individual flower off of the spike. It forms very closely, or has a very short petiole that is very close to the actual stem. You have a panicle, and where you see that we have these florets, just like in your floral types. You have a floret, which is basically a set of many flowers, or you think about it also leaflets, where you have smaller, a compound leaf, where you have leaflets that are all part of one structure on one petiole extending from the branch. So this is kind of the same concept on the panicle, as you have this petiole extending from the main stem, and then you have these little florets that are kind of branching off of that little petiole, okay? And then you have the raceme, which is kind of like in the middle between these two. It still has a single inflorescence on each petiole, but the petiole, if you look compared to the spike, you got a little bit longer petiole. So we don't have the kind of diversification with the floret that we do on the panicle, but we still have that elongated petiole. So those would be your three morphological inflorescences when we talk about turfgrass. So again, this would be a bluegrass panicle. So this would be the panicle inflorescence or seed head. And again, this would be a bluegrass. So it shows you how you have these long petioles coming off, and then you have the little flowers or florets on this petiole extending from the main stem. Okay. These would be examples of spikes. So on the left here, we have foxtail. You may have seen this growing in some meadow areas. So you see again, there is a petiole there, but it's very, very tight to the stem. Almost can't tell it's there. And then, this would be annual rise. So again, you have a little bit looser alternation of the inflorescence coming off of that stem. But again, very, very short petiole, almost can't tell it's there. You can have multiple spikes. Okay, this is still a spike inflorescence, but you can have multiple spikes at the end of the stem, like you would have in, say, goosegrass or crabgrass. So again, just a little bit different variation. But again, here would be, if you look here would be your stem that gives rise to the inflorescence, and then you have these spikes or spikelets that are forming off of that main stem. Again, you can have multiple spikes on a plant versus one single spike as you do here. So again, this is another example. This would be a weedy grass in the south called Dallas grass. I don't think I've really seen it up here yet. People would swear they have, but I haven't found it. Again, multiple spikes, a little bit different orientation, where this would almost be considered like a palmate, like a palmate where it's splitting out from a central point. This would be more of an alternating set of spikes along the stem. So again, the whole premise is that you can have a slightly different variation when it comes to the spikes. Panicles are pretty much panicles, and the racemes are pretty much racemes, but when we talk about the spikes, there is a little bit of variation in there, whether it's a single spike or you can have multiple spikes on the stem. So, and here are a couple of nice examples of the raceme. And again, you can see here how you have this a little bit longer, call it a petiole, but it's in grass, we refer to it as the pedicel. So these are cheatgrass, and then on the right here is orchard grass. So this would be an example of a raceme. And so again, the difference here, you can see that pedicel that's coming off of the flower stem. You don't see that here in the spike. So it's a kind of like almost like a loose spike if you think about it that way, just a little bit shaggier because it has that longer pedicel coming off. So when we get into the actual spikelet on the flower itself, again we have that pedicel. So this would be the pedicel here where it's coming off of that main stem. You have the outer gloom, okay, and the outer gloom is the outer shell on that flower. You have your floret, okay. You have awns, palea. We're going to get all this in a minute, but again, the pedicel would be like the petiole or the stem on that flower. So think about a rose, think about a daisy, think about any number of flowers. You have that petiole The pedicel would be synonymous with the petiole or the stem that the flower originates from. Okay, so then we get into the glume. The glume is the lower bract. So it's like the lemna or the lemma and the palea. There's usually two glumes. Sometimes there's one and rarely there's none. So sometimes if we actually are lucky enough to see a grass plant flowering, if we really need to dive into identifying it and we can zoom in on that flower, these, whether it has one glume, two glumes, or none, can help us to identify the plant. These would be the lowermost, if we look here, these would be the lowermost, I guess you would call them like almost like a sepal on the flower. They would be the lowermost, okay? And then we get into the floret itself. So the floret or the actual flower. So these would probably be synonymous with the sepal on a flower, a typical flower that we would think of. And then you actually get into the actual flower and the floral structures itself. So we have the perianth, which is the non-reproductive part of the flower. Okay. We have the bracts, which are the remnants of sepals or outer whorl of petals. We're not exactly sure what causes them, but they would be basically the outer petals on a flower. So you have the lemma, which would be the outer petal. You have the awn, which is like a long hair-like feature that would be at the end of the lemma. And then you have the palea, which is like the inner petal on a flower. If you figure like a multi-petaled flower like a peony or a rose, think about those, instead of it being a simple flower like a compound flower where you have all of these multiple petals inside of the flower structure itself. And so the palea would be like those innermost, lemma would be the outermost. The glume would be like those sepals, which are those little green vegetative leafy-like structures below the petals on a flower. Okay. And then inside of the palea emerges you figure the lemma and the palea kind of work together to encapsulate the reproductive structure. So as they open, they reveal inside the loticule, which is similar to petals. There's usually 1 to 3 of them in there. So again, this is actually a very complex flower if you think about it. And then you have the ovary, okay, which would be what gives rise to the seed. Again, this ovary is what makes this an actual angiosperm. So inside this protective structure is where the seed is actually going to sit. And then you have the stamen, or anther, and the stamen actually have the pollen. All right, so the plant is, this would be, as you can see, if you look at a grass plant and you look at the flower, it doesn't look like much. They're not very striking when you think about it, but, when you blow them up and you look at them at this standpoint, you can see it's a very, very complex and complicated flower structure. Probably, I would say, of the angiosperms, grasses probably have the most complex and intricate flower of any flowering plant. It is very unique when you really break it down on this level. Again, here we are looking at a different picture of the floret. Here's the anthers. Okay, this would be what gives rise to the pollen. And then you have the stigma, which are what extend from the ovary. So these structures, these feather-like structures, are what catch the pollen. Again, you can see the loticules here. So those would be, again, they're like a modified flower petal, like an innermost flower petal. And then you see the palea here. In this, obviously the lemma is not in it, but you can see the palea, which is giving rise again to it's kind of the innermost of that shell around the reproductive structure. The palea would be the innermost one. So that's pictured in here. So you can see it kind of encapsulates everything, and then as that opens up, it reveals all of the sexual structures of the plant. So differences between the flower on grasses and other angiosperms. Well, it comes down to this: wind pollination versus insect or other vectors. So wind pollination is extremely important to grass. Most of the regions where grasses inhabit, again, if they developed in a time when climatically things might be very different than they are today, they put all of their effort into other things like the crown, the roots. So all of this stuff above ground, the plant doesn't care about as much. I mean, the grass blades are important. It can't photosynthesize without those, but it can afford to spend those. It can also afford to spend the flower. Again, the flower is really there to be kind of a one and done. And the grass, as another survival mechanism, it's not putting a whole lot of eggs in this cart, okay? It has the ability to very prolifically reproduce with seed. And that, again, is because of wind pollination. It's not relying on insect pollination the way other flowers do. And so flowers, actually, if you think about a lot of our flowers in our gardens and stuff, they have to put on a show. They have to attract those insects, those pollinators to them. Grass doesn't need to. It's using another mechanism to reproduce or to sexually reproduce, and that is wind. And there's always wind, okay? There's always wind. So it's very easy for it to release that pollen in the wind and have it carried away and land on other flowers, okay? But it's not relying on insects for pollination. It's relying on wind. So it's not putting a whole lot of resources in. Again, it shouldn't detract from just how complex the flower structure is. Clearly, this is a very highly evolved flower structure, but again, it's not relying on insects to do the job. It can't. So it's using wind to do it for it. So it allows for conservation of other resources that aren't wasted on flowers. And we talked about this. Flowers this doesn't do a whole lot of anything for the plant. This whole structure, as beautiful as we find it, serves no other purpose, okay? And as soon as the pollination job is done, it's going to senesce these petals and everything, because again, this is taking energy from this plant. Okay, it has to keep this alive until the insects come in and do their job. And then as soon as it's done, it triggers the plant to start killing off that flower so that it can get to the business of producing seed in that ovary. So once it's done, it's done. Grass, it's not wasting a whole lot of time and resources on this. Again, it's going to do its job. It's going to drop the external structures of that flower, and it's going to put all of its resources into producing that seed. And this allows it to live in environments that are less suitable for other types of plants. Because again, if you don't have other food sources, you don't really have insects you can rely on. This is a perfect example of probably what a typical grassland looked like back during the ice ages, at least in these hot temperate zones, these arid zones. Again, it's going to use the advantage of the wind in these areas to reproduce. So they have the ability to produce both sexually and asexually. And this isn't a unique characteristic to all plants, or to grass, I'm sorry. It's not something that is specific or unique to grass, but grass does it really well. And this ability to produce both sexually and asexually is what allows it to survive so well in a variety of different conditions. So if it's a bad year, it may not produce any seed. And we run into this depending on the years out in Oregon and Washington and British Columbia, depending on any given year when they're growing out a grass crop. Not every year is good. So sometimes grass may say, you know what, I'm not feeling good about 2021, and 2020 sucked and I'm not feeling so good about 2021. So I think I'm just going to put my effort into, tillering and rhizomes and stolons. And, and sometimes they won't even grow the rhizome or the stolon. Okay. Sometimes they're just going to tiller. It just depends on how that grass plant is feeling at any given time. But it is beautiful, and it is a really great attribute of grasses that they have the ability to almost kind of make decisions about how they want to spend their resources in order to reproduce. Okay. And I think the logic from the grass plant standpoint is, if there is any kind of logic, is I can produce more tillers and I can produce more daughter plants. And those daughter plants, if we have a good year, those daughter plants are going to be able in a good year to mature and send up a seed head, and produce seeds. So again, it's all part of the big scheme of survival here. So the location of all meristematic growth, again, as we talked about, is in the crown, close to the soil level. That's what makes grass extremely resilient and able to survive harsh weather conditions, heavy traffic, grazing, mowing. So the fact that crown is the consolidated growth part of the plant and it's down at that soil level, it's kind of in a lot of ways out of harm's way. Okay, so even on our athletic fields, if we think about things like phrase mowing, verticutting, stuff like that, yeah, you're going to have some losses out of the grass plant, but it's amazing if you come back a month or two after you phrase mowed an athletic field. It's amazing just how much of that grass survived. Okay, you're still going to have to reseed after phrase mowing, because I'll tell you, it does a number. It's literally one step away from stripping the grass off completely. It's amazing how much of that grass has the ability to survive. And that we use that practice on athletic fields. Sometimes if we get overrun with poa annua or something else, it can be part of a management tool that we use to basically clean the surface and remove those weedy grasses and other stuff that we don't want in there, because it only leaves the grass that we want, to survive. And that can sometimes be an important management tool. It's not commonly used, but again, the ability of, the tougher grass, the tougher grass's crown to weather the abuse, while the weaker plants, say poa annua, which is growing on the surface, kind of weak, shallow rooted, gets stripped away, carried away with the junk and disposed of, that can be beneficial. This trait in grass helps us with management. It's also what allows us to be able to use grass so extensively in a mowed setting, because let's face it, it's probably not very beneficial or sanitary to allow grass to grow unmaintained. It's one thing out in the country, if we want to maintain an area as fallow or as pasture, that's fine. But when we look at our landscape settings, like in our urban and suburban areas, that's not very beneficial. And it does create health and nuisance issues to not maintain that grass. But again, like we talked about under the benefits, grass is relatively cheap to install and maintain. So, and this is one of the ways that it's cheap to maintain. You can get out there and mow it over and over and over and over and over again every week, sometimes mow it every 3 or 4 days. And that's a really great benefit to grass because of the location of that crown. Again, the crown is the only part of the plant that can't be replaced. So when it is damaged by scalping, when it's damaged by heavy traffic, a lack of oxygen, say this got flooded or it was under ice cover over the winter, or insects, this crown gets killed, this isn't coming back. Okay, it's going to have to be reseeded, or if given time, The other grass around here will tiller back into this space, or it will grow rhizomes or stolons. And over time, if you give it a few weeks, you'll see brand new little, daughter plants potentially coming up in one of these areas. Okay. Again, that high carbohydrate content in the crown makes it a target for insects and diseases both. So those insects and diseases, again, a fungus doesn't photosynthesize. A fungus is kind of like a plant, but it lives by parasitizing or breaking down other living and decaying living things. Okay, so sometimes a fungus will parasitize a plant. It will actually come in there and it will attack the plant. It will insert its little, mycelia, into that, and it will start digesting and breaking down the inhabitants or the makeup of that plant. It'll turn it into soup and suck it up like a straw through the mycelia and then use it to grow. Insects, the same thing. They'll go down. This, in this case, would be a billbug. The billbug will get in there. It will burrow into the stem of the grass plant. It will actually eat its way down to the crown. It will sit down in that crown. It will eat the entire crown before it comes out. It will emerge out of an exit hole out of the crown right at the soil level, and then it pupates and it turns into another billbug. Okay, so this is the only Achilles heel on the grass plant, but it's one, again, that the grass plant can overcome, because if it's grown rhizomes, stolons, if it's produced viable seed and that seed is sitting dormant in the soil, or it's tillered out, it has the ability to survive these kinds of attacks. So that is it for the morphology portion of the turfgrass class. And again, if you have any questions or comments about it, feel free to reach out to me. And at this point, if we don't have anything else to cover, you don't have any other questions, the next session that we will be moving into, we're actually going to start kind of one by one going through, a collection of some of the main grass species that we see in the landscape setting, both cool and warm season. I do want to talk about both because I think that they, again, I don't know where you guys are going to end up in life. Some of you might move further south or out west. And, I'm not going to pretend to be the expert on warm season. I will tell you this, there isn't a lot of significant difference at the end of the day. I go down to Florida quite a bit. I've got family down there. I've got people I work with down there. And there isn't a lot of difference really when it comes down to it and how we maintain those grasses versus grasses up here. So you can, if you have a southern or a warm season grass, you can kind of find its cool season counterpart up here, and whatever you do with say a tall fescue up here, you'd want to do with St. Augustine down there, and whatever you do with bentgrass up here, you probably want to do with Bermuda down there. So, there isn't necessarily a lot of difference when it comes to the maintenance and upkeep of them. But, because we're in Cleveland, we're in Northeast Ohio, I'm going to focus primarily on our cool season grasses. But I am going to get into the warm season grasses as well, because I think it's important. Also, if you plan on doing the NCLC competition, you're going to have both cool season and warm season. You're going to have beneficial turf species. You're also going to have some weedy species. So I also, when I was looking at, what do I want to talk about with the grasses specifically, I did kind of, look at, well, what are a lot of the ones that are on the NCLC competitions for the turf identification portion of that. So I did want to try and include some of that in those discussions. So if there's nothing else, I don't think I have anything else at this point. So this would conclude Module 5, Turfgrass Morphology. And again, If you have any questions, any comments, anything more you want to poke my brain about, go ahead and email me, text me. You can call me again, leave a message. If I don't recognize a number, I may not call it. I get a lot of spam, as I'm sure you guys do also. I'm tired of all of these stupid, car warranty things that keep calling me, and whatever collection calls for people that had my number 14 years ago, that are somehow I'm still on some list, or they're still so anyways, my point is, if you do try and get a hold of me, if you're trying to call me for any reason, please leave a message. Texting works really well too. And if you want to do like a Zoom meet or a WebEx or something like that, we can also set something up along those lines as well. So all right, this is it for Module 5, and I look forward to seeing you guys in Module 6.